Hi, I'm Chris Steyerwald. I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute, and it is my great good fortune to welcome you today to what I think is going to be a pretty great conversation with some pretty great journalists. The news business is first and foremost always that. It's a business. How media companies make or usually lose money is a driving force behind many of the ills about which Americans rightly complain in journalism. Shoddy reporting, sensationalism, a preference for conflict, and now, probably more than any time in my memory as a journalist, bias. As news outlets struggle to find profits after the great digital disruptions of the past 2 decades, the same social media pressures that did them in offer a pathway to profits. Media scholar Andrei Miroshnichenko coined the phrase post-journalism to describe the trend. Unable to sell large, diverse audiences to advertisers, news outlets increasingly focus on developing highly habituated users. But to cultivate that kind of intense reader, viewer, or listening audience, it's necessary to do what? You have to have strong feelings. Fear, resentment, anger, those work wonders. And outlets also feel great pressure to stop doing really the one thing that truly separates news from entertainment, which is sometimes telling people what they don't want to hear. Like, I don't know, like Joe Biden is going to win the election. Rather than face opposition from the journalists actually making the content to keep users clicking, very often folks in the newsroom are pushing the same way. Reporters increasingly disdain the old virtues of fairness and balance as bothsidesism, reimagining the ancient vice of bias as something brave. Opinion pages become more homogenous, story selections become more predictable, and maybe most ominously, post-journalism produces stifling groupthink inside news organization and serious consequences for the journalist who dissent. But take heart, we are joined today by some of the very best journalists working today. All three of our guests have distinguished themselves not just for their skills as writers, but for their willingness to do what all of us in the news business should want to do: push people out of their comfort zones and force us all to confront the world as it is, not as we wish it would be. Together, we're going to explore how they have managed to succeed and what other current and aspiring journalists should know as they navigate these rocky shoals. And we will get to your questions, which we are excited to receive. You can send them to the great Samantha Goldstein at samantha.goldstein@aei.org, or you can hashtag it on Twitter, but at hashtag AEI postjournalism, but never tweet. Okay, so first I want to introduce Caitlin Flanagan, raised in Berkeley, California. Caitlin received a BA and an MA in art history at the University of Virginia before becoming an English teacher and college counselor for a prestigious private high school in Los Angeles. She has been acclaimed for her work for The New Yorker and since 2001 at The Atlantic. So given that resume, why is it that her pieces have come hurtling into my inbox from conservative friends with great regularity? You just have to read this, they always say, of an article, whether it's about cuckoo parents at elite schools, the creepiness of Woody Allen and the Me Too movement, or even the abortion debate. It's not so much that they agree with her, but they feel, as the kids would say, seen by her. Rather than pat answers, she prefers complexity. She is the author of To Hell with All That, Loving and Loathing Our Inner Housewife, and Girlland. And I offer the highest compliment any writer can give to another. I am jealous of her gifts. Thomas Chatterton Williams' first 2 books, Losing My Cool, How a Father's Love and 15,000 Books Beat Hip Hop Culture, and Self-Portrait in Black and White, are powerful considerations of race and the limits of our cultural imagination in a binary black and white understanding of identity. Thomas's work has appeared in the London Review of Books, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, in addition to his regular writings for Harper's and The New York Times Magazine. Last year, Thomas helped write a letter on justice and open debate for Harper's Magazine with 153 signatories defending free speech and opposing what we now patently call cancel culture. He is working on a book exploring illiberalism and polarization. Good timing. He is a Berlin Prize winner and holds degrees from Georgetown and NYU. He is brave and brilliant in his writing, and I am proud not only to have him with us today, but as my colleague here at AEI, where he is a non-resident fellow. Lastly, Michael Powell is a reporter's reporter, if I dare say. He's national reporter for the New York Times. He is dogged in his search for the truth. He is unafraid to take on controversial topics. He graduated with a degree in history from SUNY Purchase and went on to study journalism at Columbia. Like many of the greats, he has covered multiple beats in multiple sections for the Times. He's been a sports columnist, a national economics writer for the business section, the Gotham columnist for the Metro section, and yes, even woe-betide campaign trail coverage. Today, Michael covers free speech and expression. His recent pieces exploring the ACLU's identity crisis and a racial reckoning at Smith College have caused so much uproar that we know he must be onto something. He's always got the goods, and he brings a temperament and style to his writing that make it accessible and powerful both. Folks, thank you very much for being with us today. Okay, I want to go around the horn one time and talk to each of you a little bit about your experience, starting with you, Caitlin. I'll let you finish.
Okay, just wetting my whistle.
Okay, then all right. So the question is, are you a controversialist by nature? Is that when you write, when you think about, because I'm thinking about your most recent piece on the University of California system and its collapse, right? And how efforts to make the UC system more accessible have turned the UC system into mush. When you think about what you want to write about and how you want to write, do you think of yourself as a controversialist, or are you just going where the story is?
Well, right now, the story, there's just so much stupidity in America that there's just low-hanging fruit. You can kind of wake up in the middle of the night and blast these things off. But I grew up in Berkeley, and there were these women, Pauline Kael, Joan Didion, whom I got to know in a way when I was a teenager. Of course, there was Susan Sontag, but I don't know. I don't love her, but there was also a very early Nora Ephron down in Los Angeles, and there was this idea that as women, you were so discounted in that area that you could just punch through into it by being funny, being sharp, caring about things that a lot of the men who really ran magazines and newspapers back then didn't even know about. So, and I think at The Atlantic, when I started there, I think I was the only woman at all that wasn't a secretary or a very junior editor. And it would be kind of like, this is a woman's topic. Let's give it to Caitlin. She knows the women. And so it was, and now it's just a very, very, very different place. But I think I've just hung on. And controversial, I'm drawn to that. I'm drawn to the against the grain opinion, very much so, very much so. I'm drawn to the dinner party conversation that's going on in one way and then sort of dropping a bomb in it. That's why I don't get many more invitations to dinner parties, but I'm very, very, very kind of temperamentally drawn to that.
Yeah, we're supposed to like to be the skunk at the garden party a little bit, right? We're supposed to want to be the ones who say the things. As a journalist, we're supposed to be the ones who I get a little charge out of it, right? Saying the thing that you're not supposed to. Speaking of things that you're not supposed to say, Thomas, your work has been controversial on and on, but maybe the most controversial thing that you've done in some ways is to say that controversy should be allowable itself. And the Harper's letter, and it included signatories from, I would describe it as a broad cross-section of the liberal world of arts, culture, and letters. And basically it was a cri de coeur that said, we're going to cancel ourselves out of existence and feed into the narrative that the authoritarian right is putting forward about all of this stuff. So why was that so important for you? Why was that something that you thought was necessary?
Yeah, well, I just want to say really quickly that, I would say it was like left to center right. There were some center right signatories as well, like David Frum and Francis Fukuyama, who are, politically quite far from Noam Chomsky. But we didn't go all the way to the right, but we tried to have some diversity, some ideological diversity in there as much as we felt we could have. But the idea that that even bad thinking or incorrect thinking or challenging thinking or offensive thinking is something that you have to be protected from, not something that you have to refute or something you have to show is flawed in some way. It is something that is just fundamentally anti-intellectual to me, and it seems to me to be completely outside of the purview of the writer to wish that everybody thought like she does. I always thought that writing and trying to think very seriously about how to see a question clearly and express it and hopefully persuade someone was often, I always assumed that that was going to be pretty solitary work. I didn't think that that was a team sport. And I've really been horrified by the degree to which many people in my generation seem to think of it as a kind of collective activity, and that they are thinking best when they're expressing the sentiments of the tribe that they believe is inherently morally superior. That's kind of the crux of it to me. And so that makes it an environment where, of course, if morality is rooted in identity and is rooted in allyship with certain persecuted identities, then any kind of disagreement is not simply a challenge to one's way of thinking. It's a challenge to one's sense of being, and it becomes something that cannot be tolerated. And then, we end up in a situation where I think we're going to pretty fast now, where you don't even know what you don't know. And I think that's the most dangerous thing about it all, is that people have a sense of the world, they have a sense of understanding the world, and they're wildly ignorant about other points of view that might actually be valuable to know about.
So, Michael, are we crazy? Am I crazy? You have worked for a long time as one of the top reporters at the top newspaper in the United States. And people like Barry Weiss and other have described this phenomenon inside the Times newsroom. But you've been doing this a long time at the top level. Are the things that we're talking about here, does this ring true for you? Is this something that's really happening, or are we imagining this?
No, I don't think you're imagining this. Look, these are complicated issues, particularly as they play out at some of the elite papers, right? Like the New York Times, the Washington Post, to a lesser extent, I think the Journal. But no, sure, look, it would be absolutely foolish of anyone to deny that we have these tensions. There was the battle over the Tom Cotton editorial, or the Tom Cotton column, and whether we should have run it. It's no secret I disagreed with my colleagues. Over 1,000 people signed a Guild letter attacking the running and saying it made us unsafe. I think that's ridiculous, frankly. We're first place. It's not up to journalists to decide who's what public officials make us safe or feel unsafe or unsafe. Notwithstanding, I also just don't think that held at that time, that the running of a column online in the New York Times somehow made very brave colleagues out in the field feel more or less safe. But I think more troubling was this sense that, I think that Thomas and Caitlin were both getting at, this sense that we need a collective take on something. Strikes me as not why I got into journalism. Look, I grew up in New York City, and the Village Voice, the old Village Voice, was one of my Bibles. They ripped each other to shreds every day, and they were all on the left. There was nobody, to be a centrist would have been a fascist, and yet they managed to have spectacular battles with each other. And I think of this as one of the great virtues of journalism, is to be able to kind of have these battles and have different takes, and the sense to which we, even including the New York Times, have to kind of battle with what is our take on something. I think is it's a sad pass.
Well, I'm bummed. All right. So the question I want everybody to jump in the pool on these, and we do have some viewer questions coming in, which we will get to. I see, and I'll start with you, Caitlin. I see a lot of as the digital disruption happened and as the business changed, when I started out writing for newspapers, we didn't know who was reading, right? You got some letters to the editor or you got whatever, and who knew, right? You wrote about what you wanted to write about or what you thought the news was or what you maybe guessed folks might want to read, but circulation numbers were no good arbiter. So as the inputs change, how much of this is inputs changing, right? So that now, and we're going to talk about Twitter more later, but as the inputs changed in the business, is that right that that's how you see this, the trouble starting?
Well, I think the trouble started in that, I try to tell you, up to about 15 years ago, I would try to explain to young people what it was like before the internet. And now I have to sort of explain it to myself. It's almost just this unimaginable time of human history that I lived through. And, when something was said, not just in the New York Times, but in your local paper or on the nightly news, well, that was just it. That was just true. And they mostly earned that, that trust that people had in them. And even if they didn't, this is where it's hard to describe to young people or for myself. Like, say you saw on the CBS Evening News, Walter Cronkite, very controversially, but very importantly, started showing how many young men were killed each day in Vietnam. And even if you thought, wow, that's a high number, is that right? What are you going to do? Call the Pentagon? You have no one to call. You literally would have to call you would literally have to do the shoe leather reporting of a journalist to do that. You'd have to go down to the library and talk to the reference librarian, and almost like an interlibrary loan book on something to who to contact. So they respected that. They earned the respect. I do think that they had. They made a few big mistakes, but the New York Times, for example, now when they run a correction, it's like you can't even understand what are they correcting. It's like purposely the most opaque writing you've ever seen is the correction. Same with my place. But in the old days, it was a very forthright, hey, we goofed, we got it wrong. Here's the difference. And I think that just more and the fact that as the press, I really think we own a big part of all that's gone wrong. I think the press that we all grew up with, respecting and just trusting and just believing in, got so arrogant that it thought it could drift and drift and drift. It never has drifted as far as Fox. It never will, I assume, drift that far. But we just arrogantly thought, oh, we all have the same opinions. I can count on one hand the Republicans I've met who work at one of these big shops. And the reason I know it's because that's like their byline. Like, we've got a Republican, let's ask him what he thinks. But so the press did not address anything neutral. And I always say journalists my age, especially male journalists, well, Michael can hopefully disprove or prove me, the effect of Watergate and the idea that two young reporters, shoe leather and notebooks and nothing else, could bring down this corrupt presidency. And, we all went to see all the President's Men in the theaters. And there's just these scenes where it's the tension of the movie is, that they're right. Bernstein and Woodward have the story. And, Ben Bradley by Jason Robards is just because you don't have the story. And so they put it on the 5th page, blah, blah, blah. And there's this, and you're like, no, they do have the story. But there's this big scene where he just yells at them, you don't have the story. And the conclusion of the movie is when they get enough evidence to run the story. And it wasn't that Bradley was tilted left or tilted right. It was just there were absolute objective standards that you had to meet. And now the Washington Post, they ran a piece on that young man, Chris Rufo, who is running they call critical race theory debate. They wanted to run a hit piece on him, and they got such basic information wrong, such basic information that the whole thing had to be sort of rewritten. And the people who wrote it, they so disbelieved something that he had said about a school district that they said it never happened. And then they called the school district and they said, yeah, that happened. So the most basic level of journalism, it's just shocking. The Times, of course, I think Times is accurate. I think, it's just the front page is it's just it's interesting. We'll see how long it lasts. I always say the Times is like a breathing organism for the cooking section. That's why I think everybody really gets it. But I think that we on the left have to take responsibility, that we work at places where everybody's a liberal, everybody's pro-choice, everybody has these feelings, and they feel very, very proud of themselves for somewhat modifying their pieces that people can't really tell. But I know there's many more forces, the internet, whatever, of course, are the big ones, but we lost our authority. We did it fair and square by ourselves.
Michael, the challenge here sometimes is we like to think that what we like is also what's good is popular. We want to believe that what's good is also popular. And the journalistic bubble that Caitlin described that was sort of born out of Ernie Pyle and all the post-war bubble that inflated itself was that this sort of objective, fact-based mainstream journalism was the thing. But of course, that's not how it was before. Right? Before bias was, the American newspaper industry was born of bias and steeped in it. But this idea, so it may be that it was never popular. It's just people didn't have choices. So it could have been that the whole time that we were, and I do look to that as a paradigm, right? That we should be fair, we should be fact-based, we should be doing all of those things. Is it possible that that's never what readers and viewers actually wanted anyway? And now that they can get the hard stuff, they're gonna leave the beer on the shelf?
It's interesting. It's a good question. I'm not sure that I agree with Caitlin entirely in that I think it's very difficult, and this isn't to sidestep many very justified criticisms of the role that media has played. But I think it's very difficult to disentangle that from the larger culture. And the culture now, right? It's a commonplace to say it's a very siloed. People don't talk to each other. I noticed this. I went to Vermont, and I have many kind of rock-ribbed Republican relatives who I love very much. But it's become in recent years difficult just to even figure out how you navigate discussions. So I think this is very much part of the world we live in. That said, yes, it's certainly true that I think, and always has been, frankly, I think at the places like the Times and the Post, reporters tend to lean liberal, sometimes left, further than liberal. I guess I'm kind of wandering here, but I'm not. There is a great pressure right now. I do think that there is a great pressure, and much of that is the echo chamber of Twitter in particular, right, for writers, to kind of to settle on a take, and that take is certainly I was going to say left of center. I know we live in a weird time for labels, right? There's also an illiberalism. I would say, just by way of example, when I did pieces on both Smith College and the ACLU, I looked at the comments on those, and they got, like 1,000 comments or more. And many of those people were clearly liberals. Many were identifying themselves as, for instance, with the ACLU, dues paying members, all this kind of stuff. And I would say, and this is not, journalism's not a plebiscite, right? So the fact that I say, which is true, that about 90%, shared sort of a view, a particular critique of the ACLU is not to argue, therefore it was right? Therefore I'm right. But it does speak to me to a certain perhaps hunger among our readers that we're not entirely cognizant of. The same thing happened with the piece I did on Smith College around racial justice and accusations and the like. Again, I was struck that really the big majority of comments saw kind of problems with where we were going. So it raises a question in my mind, the extent to which our assumption, right, that our readership is left liberal and kind of with us on this journey. I'm not sure of that.
Thomas, what I would call quasi-religious anti-racism is the driving force in a lot of what we're talking about here. And that was when the open letter that you helped draft says, these are good. Fighting racism is good. We should definitely fight racism. We should do those things. But it's very hard to argue with someone who is, if opposing a person's point of view is racist, then de facto you're blocked out. This is a very powerful cudgel. You've written about how deadly dangerous a tool this can be. As we think about this in terms of how to cover story, how to do stuff, what should we be receiving there in terms of how to handle this in a way that is sympathetic to the hope that we could ostracize racists and do all of that stuff, but not crush dissent and not crush the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky question because the answer is that people have to be willing, some people have to be willing to stand up and say that you don't get to actually like redefine common terms we all like must use to interact with each other. So I always put, anti-racism is a word that you simply can't concede to an activist branch of a political movement. You actually have to insist that you can define anti-racism in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. and people have always used the term without getting into this new kind of anti-racism TM that I put in quotes, which is a specific kind of agenda-driven business in some senses, and in other senses is a kind of cult-like religion. I mean, I think that they're actually, to be clear, I think that we have to actually fight over language and words, and it's on that level. And I think that a lot of people privately comment on how they don't think that what's being called anti-racism is necessarily an accurate depiction of the world as they see it, or they see the stakes are being manipulated, or that they see that people are being called racist for things that are simply outrageous. I think that a lot of those people are afraid to actually say anything, and so that it makes it seem as though there's much more consensus than there is. And the only way to answer your question, the only way to fight that is for people to actually stand up, and somebody has to stand up first, and other people have to stand up with them. But I've been in situations where I've been in professional situations where there are dozens of people talking about something and a kind of anti-racist language is inserted. And I just said, there's no way that I'm going along with this thing with that language. It's insane. And as soon as I said that, in the instance I'm thinking of, and I won't say exactly where I was, as soon as I said that, then a Latino reporter said, you know what, I agree. And then suddenly privately, like 7 white people emailed and said, that's actually crazy. I never would have said that, but I agree too. And maybe I should actually say so publicly instead of just privately. And I said, yeah, of course you should say instead of privately. Otherwise, it's just me and this other guy. And so then you realize that most people actually don't agree with this thing. Like 3 people were insisting be put into a document that we were all signing. Do you see what I'm saying? Nobody. Yeah. 37 people out of 40 didn't agree with it. But everybody would have gone along with it.
By the way, how much of that effect after that open letter came out, how much of that did you get of people who said, I agree with this. I'm not a signatory, but I totally agree with what you're doing?
Hundreds of people, if not thousands of people. And some people, saying, I wouldn't have been asked to sign this, but thank God you did this because I'm an academic at this university. And, thank God that I can point to a document that shows that X, Y, and Z are saying this is a problem as well. And I'm not just crazy. So many people.
Caitlin, how is your Twitter abstemiousness going? Are you abstaining?
I'm what they call California sober. So I'm... or that heroin addicts used to call chipping, which is really dangerous. So I went through my 28 days of Twitter rehab, kind of like John Mulaney, like I got to do it. And it was hard, and then it was great. And then it's become so deep into what we do that there have been a few times that for work, I've had to do something. And my son's like, you never have to go on Twitter. But there were just times when even editors were saying, you should probably go and look at what this person is saying. And it just is so addictive. It's so attractive. It's so alluring. I got an email from somebody when I ran a piece saying that I was going off Twitter. And he said, the way he said, I'm a recovering alcoholic. What you described is exactly what I go through a lot of my life, of just wanting to go back to it. But as a Berkeley girl, if you had said in Berkeley to anyone, hey, wouldn't it be great if a major corporation could insinuate itself into our minds, could have worked with majorly talented people to sort of brainwash us through the kinds of responses we get, that we cannot leave the control of the corporation? It would just be unthinkable, unfathomable. And, you know, people think of Twitter as a conduit to getting their original thoughts out. But to get those thoughts out, you have to first be addicted. So the main thing that's going on there is an addiction to a corporation that does not mean us well. You know, they didn't sit there and say, I know a really good way to help people get news out about the Arab Spring. They were sort of like, hey, people really like this feature of Facebook. Let's capitalize on that and just carve it out itself. So I'm trying to stay off Twitter. I decided I would be very high-minded. Yes, I did this yesterday. And I would have a recommendation a day about like a book or a podcast and just
very
put
wholesome.
that up. But also I'm feeling, I don't know. That's the near beer of it all. So I am a recovering, but also failing Twitter addict. I'm the Betty Ford of Twitter, because I think that even when she started the Betty Ford clinics for alcohol rehab, she did have a few lapses herself and was very public about them. So I'm ready to open up my facility, but I don't want to ever for one of my patients to think that I am on any ground different than they are. We are all struggling together.
In the great F. Scott Fitzgerald story about the autobiographical story where his wife dies in the snow in Paris, and then he goes to call on her family to try to regain custody of his daughter, and he walks in and he says, well, I have one drink a day just so it doesn't turn into too big of a thing. I figure that way I'll keep it in perspective by having one a day. Michael,
revisit it. Yeah.
Michael, I have told so many young reporters, have told so many young journalists over time, Twitter is not the point, right? And I watch these reporters that tweet out everything that they're doing all of the time. And if they worked for me, I would say, take the app off your phone. What are you doing? That should be going into a story. If it doesn't go into the story, it doesn't exist. But they are, as Caitlin describes, it's a powerful space, and you get a lot of affirmation from your peers or your betters, right? You have people who are more established say, great point from so-and-so. And then all of this stuff is immediately wiped out by what's coming next. Do you tweet? Do you tell people not to tweet? How does Twitter intersect with your experience?
Oh, I certainly tweet, and I can feel my brain leaking out of my ears every day with it. But look, it is. I think Caitlin's absolutely right. It's like this addiction, and and I took a break from myself, and I was on vacation for 3 weeks, and it felt great. But I'm back there, and it's. I mean, look. Okay, now I will add one good thing for it. I follow both the people on this screen. I follow a lot of people, and it's a quick way of getting some interesting, very often contrarian voices that you simply wouldn't hear as regularly, right? I mean, Thomas does great stuff. He does not write daily, doesn't write weekly. Thank God for him, right? Because he's able to write what he wants. The same thing with Caitlin. So to a certain extent, I could make a contrarian argument itself that it is useful, that sometimes when you think that you're, losing your mind because you're the only one who's thinking a certain way, it is possible to find really smart, interesting people in, whatever those, the in English, is that we have, number of characters we have on Twitter. So in that sense, it can be very useful. Sometimes, frankly, for my purposes, if I'm trying to get a sense of where somebody stands on the ACL, or say within the ACLU on freedom of speech, they're very often going to be at their most unfettered, maybe around the kitchen table, but then on Twitter, right? And that's sort of that's wonderful if you're a reporter for kind of harvesting things. So all of that said, yes, I would mainly tell all reporters, including myself, to spend less time there, because you're just, it's interesting. There's been a debate on Twitter, an interesting one, about crime, right, and kind of the causes of the recent surge and all this sort of thing. I live a mile from East Flatbush, where 1,000 years ago I was a tenant organizer, and I know a lot of people there. I guarantee you, because I did it as a columnist, that I would find out more about what's going on with crime if I walked out to East Flatbush, which I can do from my house in Ditmas Park, and get there and talk with people. And there's this tendency, so there is instead this tendency, and I think it's, we're all susceptible to thinking that Twitter's the world, that, if I just follow the right couple of criminologists or whatever, I'm going to know. And that's really dangerous and kind of sad.
Well, all you had to do is look at the Democratic 2020 nominating process as the very online bell jar of the Twitter world collided with the middle-aged and older African-American voters of South Carolina who said, I think not. I think rather not.
And if I could just quickly add, that happened here with the mayoral race. Yeah. I mean, everybody assumed they understood where African-Americans were, and they came down voting for a black ex-cop with a pretty centrist, center liberal take. So anyway, yes.
Thomas, defend Twitter. Go ahead. You make it better. You do make it better, but and I haven't tweeted in years. I want you to know that remission is possible. That you can get there, Caitlin.
Okay.
Actually, I think it was 2019. In the summer of 2019, I went on vacation and took it off my phone and never went back. But also, I will confess that, as you guys say, to do a story, sometimes I have to go. I always go through the browser and go look and see, okay, what are people doing and saying out here? But Thomas, you are one of the best things on Twitter. What do you make?
Tell that to my wife, please. Tell it to my wife, please.
I'm not going to get in trouble with your French wife. There's no way. I'm not making any French women mad today, as a rule. Why is it good? Why is it worthwhile for journalists?
For journalists, it can be good. I mean, I've gotten work out of Twitter many times. You tweet, you can use Twitter as a kind of testing ground to work out. It can be bad and good. It's kind of neutral. It depends on how you use it. But you can work out first drafts of thoughts or arguments, and you can kind of see what counter arguments are. Sometimes, from people who are not in the media or who are not necessarily known, or sometimes even anonymous, they can be extremely incisive in their in their feedback to you. And sometimes, because the media is all on Twitter, an editor at the Times op-ed page, at the Guardian, at the Atlantic, that's happened to me several times at the Atlantic, will see an argument that you began to flesh out on Twitter and say, would you like to develop that into a piece? And you actually hadn't been actively pitching it, but then you think, maybe I would like to develop that more. And so that's worked into that. That's been, over the years, something that's happened to me numerous times, and I thought that was valuable. I think that it is valuable to be able to say things like Michael was pointing out, say things kind of immediately. Writing is long and it's solitary, especially when you're in between books or long reported pieces. You can kind of, I don't want to write an essay on Simone Biles or Naomi Osaka, but maybe I do want to talk to a lot of people who I find to be kind of interesting. I want to just let them know that I think that actually, there's nothing wrong, and there's even something maybe admirable about what Simone Biles did or Naomi Osaka did, but it's not better than winning, as the new media narrative is kind of insisting that it is. I don't want to actually write 5,000 words on that. Maybe not now. Maybe later I do. Maybe the pushback and the counter arguments will make me think that there's more to say. So it's a way of, of thinking out loud. What's really problematic about it is that I do think that it plays an outsized role on the masthead. I think that there's a illusory effect that it seems, because everybody in the media thinks that Twitter is the world, it seems as though that's actually being mistaken for the world. And, I think that journalists and writers are put in a very difficult position, which is that, and is contradictory, and editors haven't really sorted this for us. There's a lot of implicit pressure to develop a following on Twitter. And to really develop a following on Twitter, you have to engage in a way that Caitlin is right to say becomes addictive. You have to do that. You cannot do Twitter unless you're very famous. You cannot do Twitter intermittently and have a large following and be influential. But then, what comes with having a large following and thinking publicly on a regular basis is that you will inevitably fall on the wrong side of consensus on certain questions. And then the blowback will be enormous, and your editors in the masthead will say, like, what are you doing? This is problematic. They're linking you to our organization. And so there are contradictory messages that you get as a writer, and you get left kind of hung out to dry in many cases. And I think that we have to figure out how to make that, it becomes actually your work environment, and it becomes very quickly a hostile work environment, but there's no recourse.
It's a gross place. It is gross. So I remain unconvinced. It's pretty gross in there. And by the way, we have a lot of nice questions in, but I would encourage everybody that audience members can submit their questions. They can write the great Samantha Goldstein at samantha.goldstein@aei.org, or they can hashtag, what's the hashtag? AEI postjournalism. If you want to go into the open sewer of Twitter, you can use hashtag AEI postjournalism. So before we get to those, fact checking and the battle over the truth and the battle over facts and all of this stuff has become exhausting, right? Should the government play a role? Should all of this stuff? What are we doing, Michael, so a reporter tells a story, right? A reporter, when you did, let's take the ACLU story. There was this good story that was sitting right on the table that nobody had really dug into in the way that you did to talk about the changes at the ACLU. So you told a whole story of many, many hundreds of words that was put together, that had a narrative in it and told a thing. It had to be fact checked. It had to be correct. You had to be sure that you were right, and your editors had to make sure that it was right. But that's a story. How is this? Talk a little bit about this discussion about is fact checking journalism? Is fact checking possible apart from journalism? Talk a little bit about that.
Let me ask you, what do you mean by fact checking? I mean
here where the battle against misinformation and who controls the facts and how we define things. Thomas talked before about control of the language and this Orwellian struggle that we're engaged in now over what means what and who says what and how that works. Here in Washington, the discussion centers around what part will the federal government play in doing all of this stuff. I work at the Dispatch, and the Dispatch is part of the fact check movement and trying to get stuff right. Talk about the difference between verification and what did Stephen Colbert used to say, truthiness, and journalism. How do they fit together? How are they different? What are your thoughts?
Right. Okay. So first off, I mean, I'm actually not a believer in objectivity. I'm a believer in fairness. But fairness goes beyond just you lean one way or the other. I mean, I think that I'm also a New Yorker, so I cannot imagine starting a story without having some preconception, some thought, some idea. But then it's the extent to which you're willing to really engage in interrogating yourself as you go along, right? And I think that's where I get nervous when people, I guess was Wesley Lowery wrote about, searching for the truth, right? That we should be about the truth. It's not always clear. I mean, and it's a very complex beast that we're after. So then, yeah, we should spend a lot of time checking facts, but of course that I could have a factually correct story on the ACLU and not have a story that's fair to the ACLU, right? And fair to its critics. I mean, so that there's there's we need to be really intellectually serious. And I hope that doesn't sound pompous, because that's as true for a reporter, at a small regional paper as it is for a reporter at the New York Times. We have to be intellectually serious. We have to treat, these are serious questions. Yeah, we have to make sure that we're sort of factually correct, but also that we're not afraid to kind of grapple with, for instance, at the ACLU in their gender rights project, the head of that project, basically argued for, I want to be careful here, is either burning or banning a particular book, right, on girls making transitions, Abby Schreier's book. And I thought that was remarkable, coming from the head, one of the heads of a unit at the ACLU. But you want to, as much as you can, engage with that and be honest about that. And I think that that's one of the places that's been interesting in the past few years, is the pushback if you try to even engage with that. Well, I've gotten emails the last few, or Twitter tweets at me in the past few weeks, every time that the ACLU does anything on free speech. That just shows they do, well, the piece never said that they've given up on free speech. I mean, these are complex organizations. These are complex people we're writing about. And I think there's a tendency to want to paint out that, wash out that complexity. And that's what I find kind of depressing about some. There's a lot of really good journalism going on, including at my place and at the Washington Post and Atlantic and other places. But I do think that that's an impulse right now in the culture, in the journalism culture, that needs to be resisted.
Of course, the free speech actions by the ACLU do come after they got their cookies burnt in the New York Times, so that may have been the causal relationship. I won't dwell on. Caitlin, this struggle over objective truth and what this is and how we do it. Is this a craft? Is this a precision? What's going to happen? You are the seer, right? You know how the story is going to turn out. So what is going to happen? Are we going to get through and over this, or are we going to never be able to agree about what the facts of the case are in order to have a worthwhile discussion?
Well, I think that what we're not accounting for is that, I went to college in the 80s. Woo, I left, 79 was my first year. And that was the real era of primary sources. If you were a historian, even undergraduates, don't read this analysis, don't read this, go find some primary sources and look at it. And it was a very, eye-opening way to do history, especially as a young person. You felt very excited. And there's nothing like setting aside the analysis and the other people and the years of, history that's gone after it, and just looking at something. And the internet has allowed people to do that. And it's a powerful, powerful thing. And going back to Chris Rufo, so again, it's kind of at the middle of this critical race theory debate. What he's ultimately done is he's put primary sources up there, and you have to look at them, and that becomes a powerful thing. And that very sort of uncredited or dislikable person, O'Keefe, what's his name? James O'Keefe, who's done really terrible things to people I actually know. So I'm not saying this is, and I'm saying this is not good at all, but he has shown some things that I did not know. And I'm looking at things and thinking, wow, I didn't know that. And I know that many of these things, if I brought them in, it would be, well, is it a one thing? Is it a trend? Is it a that or the other? And I think that that's another thing we have to face as journalists, is that a lot of things, if we're not in charge of telling people what they can find, they can find it on their own. And that's the thing that we have to all somehow account for. And then I just was thinking about all this because I had a piece about taking the SATs out of the UC admission. And there was somebody, some sort of very kind of like post-grad doc student within the system, and he had sent this huge list of things that were incorrect. And the mighty, and I don't even worry anymore. I don't know, I'm an old broad, do what you do it with this. But our mighty team went to work, and thank God there was one really specific thing, fine. But people, that was the thing. I had to look at Twitter a bit, and people were like, oh, the Atlantic, they didn't have time to even send this to anybody. It was just this ridiculous assumption about a process that, if anything, is overly precise and overly sure. And you have to kind of protect. I always say that the fact checker protects the publication, and the writer protects the reader. Because we're like, well, okay, I'll take this out and I'll do this, but it's got to be funny, or it's got to be this, or it's got to be that. So the shops that are still doing that, I mean, I can't tell you how laborious it was for these people, the fact checkers at the Atlantic, to go through, and lawyers to go through. It was like a Byzantine trying to get anything online at the University of California. It's like the kid was ultimately arguing against the publications of his own university because they all said different things. So the places that it's so expensive. It is so expensive to fact check, to have these kids, young people, have senior people training them, but training them is really difficult. And ultimately, they don't want to do it forever, usually. So you spend all this time and money training them. And then, I want to be a writer, or I want to go into assistant editorial work instead, and ultimately be an editor. So I think that we're in this tension that, well, I would just say this. What an old editor of mine used to always say about checking, in England, they have almost no checking in their papers, and the public are the checkers, So it's like you put it out there, and you know how it is. 2 seconds later, if something's wrong, you're going to hear from them. And that was a system that kind of worked, I guess. But there are just places, for example, in the Times, I know it's a fact. I do. There are things I question, but the Times fact. Washington Post, I don't know anymore. And that piece on Chris Rufo, I just thought, well, that's it. That is the goddamn end, that they cannot even get the fact of what a school district did or didn't do, which is one telephone call to find out. They have completely lost my trust. I know that's a big statement. I'm sure I won't say it tomorrow, but I just was they lost me right there. I'm like, what the hell is going on with people?
It has not been a great run for the Post of late. And I'm not just saying that, Michael, because you're here. It has not been a great run for the Post of late. Thomas, Caitlin points out this stuff is expensive. Doing the kind of journalism that I think we would all hope that publications would aspire to have. Harper's is great because it's surprising, it's interesting, it's obviously not, it is anti-clickbait, it is great to read, but it's expensive to have, your publications are very expensive to put out. And at the Dispatches, we're trying to figure out how to do this on a subscriber basis. Good journalism is really expensive, but you know what's cheap to free is BS from BSers who are going to opinionate and opinionize and not do the work and not do the research and can just go scroll through Twitter, come up with 4 tweets, put them together, package them up as a story, and then run off. Do you think that there is a model for journalism that can account for the enormous costs related to quality journalism and functionally work? Or are we going to be down to like 4 places in the whole world?
We're down to a few places, but those places are doing pretty well these days, actually. So I'm more optimistic now than I was. There is a hunger for quality. There's more people willing to pay for it who have been trained over years now to pay for it than there were when I was starting out. And when I was coming out of grad school at NYU, it was like, will the New York Times actually fold because Carlos Slim, a Mexican billionaire, has like a 25% interest loan on their building? And like now the Times is really, really succeeding. Harper's is doing well. Harper's benefits from having, one very wealthy man who funds it at a loss every year, but, who really believes in it and can't be peer pressured or browbeat into getting in line with whatever the correct thinking is. He's that sometimes an eccentric patron, I think, is what saves us. But this, the subscription models are kind of promising now. So I think that what you're getting at is a deeper problem, though, which is that more people than ever are writing. More people than ever are kind of in the conversation about media because of social media, and more people than ever are writing. And it seems often to me that there's more writers than there are readers. It's a really weird pyramid. No one's reading anybody, but everybody's writing always. But it's true that like the easiest way to get in the game is to just have opinions and to have takes and to have like very passionately held, ideologically inflected arguments, polemics, and that often is the exact opposite of what like Michael or Caitlin are doing when they're going out and they're just like asking people what's really going on at this college. Like, I've heard a lot of takes, but let me go see what's going on. That is harder to do. I mean, after I get off this with you and have dinner, I have to get on the phone for like the 5th time with a fact checker at Harper's over my column, because the opinion writing is actually quite heavily fact checked. And I think that's just a wonderful thing that very few people are any longer media savvy enough to even know is separating. Like, my aunt doesn't even really know that is separating like something that I'm publishing in Harper's and the New York Times from like this random website that she's sending me to contradict some subject we're talking about. That's what's very frustrating. Caitlin is right to say that a fact of the Times, there's a lot of mistakes that go into the Times, but a fact in the Times is a fact, and if it's not a fact, tomorrow it will be made a fact. And you need audiences. You need audiences to actually be able to be media literate. And I think that part of the problem is certainly what's going on with economic incentives of the publications, but there's a huge problem, which is the audiences are failing too.
And the last thing you want to do, and my experience tells me that the companies would do whatever the audiences wanted, right? If they wanted the sky to be green, sky's green. That's because on the profit basis, that's what they're going to do. Okay, let's go to the audience questions. And I don't know who is trolling me or not. How is it possible for trustworthy general interest news to reach a unified mass audience in the era of filter bubbles? And I will say it can't. I'll answer for you. It can't. And then the question is, should social media corporations be made to provide a, quote, standard list, close quote, of news items everyone is exposed to? Please, God, agree with me that that's not right. Michael Powell, what do you think?
No, I'm not in favor of that. And I'm also not in favor, by and large, of banning people from social media. And it's not a First Amendment question, right? Because these are not government institutions. But I think it nonetheless takes the culture down a very dangerous place, more dangerous than the speech itself, which can be dangerous. I mean, there are certainly, truly disturbing perspectives that you can read on social media. But anyway, so no, I don't want to see a list of things. And for all that we've talked about, for instance, Twitter and the many kind of brain numbing aspects of it, I'd rather take my chance at trying to navigate that than see some sort of imposed solution.
Amen.
Imposed solution.
Amen. Caitlin, another of our guests today, says, if the journalism industry were to take seriously the creation and adoption of industry standards, along with some process or methodology by which the industry could hold itself accountable to those standards, what would that require? what would the standards making body and the standards themselves look like? And would this even help the status quo? So I guess the question here is, can you have like an American medical...
I don't even know what, oh God, I don't know.
It would be like having the American Medical Association or the Bar Association.
But they've lost the American Medical Association has lost my trust as well. You know, look at any standard, you know, textbook for journalism 101, or as a great book by a guy named Gene Foreman called Ethical Journalism, who was a top editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer for many years. There are standards, but there's absolutely no one imposing them on us. You know, the only people imposing standards on the writers are the editors, who, you know, say, well, we don't do this or we don't do that, and they'll explain why, and it makes sense. And but I just think we at the few remaining places, the three of us are on here, but right now I'm saying Elias Thomas writing for the Harpers and not the Atlantic, so I'll be working on that as soon as I get off the phone here. But you know, we have to, the places that still have reputations, Harper's, the New York Times, the Atlantic, you know, and maybe the little Washington Post, the little paper that could, maybe it can pull itself together. And we have to hold the line 100%. And and just to tell you how that works, a colleague of mine had a fact in a piece that ran, and I was convinced it was not accurate. And I went down a rabbit hole to prove that it was not accurate. And the wonderful Yoni Applebaum, who's one of our senior editors, and is just a genius, and he's a serious historian, and he's one of the kindest people I've ever known. He patiently spent an hour and a half of his time going through these documents with me until finally he found the thing that made me go, oh, I'm wrong. Excuse me. You know, I will now end our conversation. You know, you can get into a position where you're just certain you're right. You're just certain someone has exaggerated it. And even still, you have to realize, oh, that was my worldview that came up against something that was not, that counteracted that or pushed against it. And only a place like the Atlantic or like these other publications has the ability to have someone that smart, that senior, put down everything to talk to a senior writer and not say, listen, you dumbass, the fact is right, go work your next piece, you know, to sit there and say, no, let's look at this, let's look at that, let's look at that. And then I realized, oh, I'm totally wrong. I'm totally wrong. We can't do that with every single reader, but the more these great places can hold the line, the more we'll get close to, you know, a few places that will follow the standards.
Can I just say one thing on that? Of course. You can't ever have like enforced standards, but we used to have norms, which were widely adhered to. And I think that the thing that we're suffering from now is a breakdown of norms and of a sense of what's fair play, what's not, just a shared culture. We don't exist in a shared culture anymore. And that's a problem in the media, but it's also a problem in the larger society.
Right.
I'm guessing perhaps a younger, maybe an aspirant, a journalistic aspirant, wants to know, many established journalists who have a nonconformist or moderate perspective are currently starting their own platforms on you-know-what? Substack. What can beginning journalists do who don't have a following and actually want to gain the concrete experience and skills at a major publication? Are there any non-politicized news outlets anymore? And I think we've covered a lot of her question. I think we've covered a lot of that ground. But Michael, on the question of, let's take the first part first. I think the second part first. I think one of the things that makes you so good is that you covered all kinds of stuff in all kinds of places to learn about how to be a real reporter, right? One of the things that I tell people is, you know, my first newspaper job, what do you cover? You cover the cop shop. You go down to the magistrate court. You watch them clean the winos out. Like, you figure out how stuff works, and you go cover this, and then you get to go cover that. And you find out that human nature, that people are basically the same, regardless of whether you're in Delbarton, West Virginia, or Washington, D.C. These are the same people with the same kinds of problems and the same foibles. How do you agree with how much do you think that your experience covering the waterfront, how did that help you be a better reporter?
Well, first off, let me apologize to the people of Vermont, because my first job was at the Burlington Free Press, and I, no doubt, I learned some lessons there that were very good for me, but perhaps not for my readers. And I'm also very pleased that those are all pre-internet, so you have to actually look at a clip file. But no, in all seriousness, look, I think it's incredibly valuable to do that. And as I say, I'm a guy with many, many opinions, and I have lots of things about which I feel passionately. But you do learn these kind of things you pick up are terrific. And I should say a quick word about, it's not just the Times, the Post, the Atlantic, and Harper's, right? I mean, I carry my bias. My son works for the Houston Chronicle, right? I mean, they do. Frankly, I'm obviously reading it far more carefully now than I did ever before. I mean, they do kind of astounding work, particularly given the kind of economic pressures that this is actually a very good sized paper. I guess about the 7th largest in the United States. But I mean, you go around, and I know this is a columnist. I mean, I'd go to, Waco, Texas. I mean, the Waco Tribune had somebody who really covered the hell out of the football team there and covered the hell out of the scandals there. So, I mean, and against kind of all odds, right? I mean, I would not ask that, that young man like the money he makes, but I'm sure it's not good. I know that the editing isn't there, this sort of thing, but there is this, I mean, it's kind of moving as you go around the country and you see the sort of work, the Milwaukee Sentinel, the Tampa Bay Tribune. I mean, you can kind of go on and on that are doing, notwithstanding that, the kind of the wings are coming off of our industry at every level, save for the elite part of the industry. And it's enormously important. And I mean, I think if you look at the Times and some of our most, I want to be really careful here, young reporters come from all different areas, but some of our most successful investigative reporters in particular come from these papers. I mean, they come from that background where you've got to dig, and they don't have fact checkers, and they don't have, I mean, I write a piece and sometimes I want to, throw myself out a window, but I've got 4 or 5 very good editors all asking really tough questions, right? That doesn't exist at most papers. And yet, nonetheless, you see a lot of people doing work and not being forced. I think if you look at the papers I just mentioned, they're not doing stuff that falls into an ideological category. Oh, that's just left stuff. That's just right stuff. It's good reporting. And out of that comes, I mean, look, I grew up on the Upper West Side. I came out an Upper West Side liberal, right? I mean, that was my environment. But because you're working at all these different places along the way, again, you learn to interrogate your biases. You learn to ask yourself if, well, what I've always thought was true actually is true. And I think that one of the better ways, without, I hope, sounding like, I'm 98 years old, is still to go through some of those papers. The trouble is, of course, that is the place where the house is on fire economically.
Yeah, I've only had one newspaper close immediately behind me as I was, and it wasn't my fault. Actually, they closed after I left, so maybe they should have kept me. So part of the problem that we experience is embedded in this question. I'm not picking on the questioner here, but if you want to cover national news and you want to be part of the national discussion, Thomas, you point out that there are more people, it seems like there's more writers than readers. Part of that phenomenon is that everybody wants to start and talk about national stuff, and we'll have another one of these one time and talk about how we'll save local news. We'll save the country by saving local news. Lord, hear our prayer. That would be great. But for an aspiring journalist, if you want to talk about the biggest issues of the day, your phone lets you can go right in and start talking about it. You can go in and be engaged. Is there merit though for people to work on what's close to them and get in at a local or entry level so that they can start to figure out how this works before they just turn in to the next 24-year-old with a phone and a lot of opinions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you want to be a reporter, I still believe knowing your region, knowing your city, being very locally oriented is an extremely important way to start. If you want to be also, I think, a different type of writer who's not necessarily a reporter, but somebody who has gets into the conversation around ideas and I guess politics and things like that, it's also good, I think, to think locally and not to necessarily always be involved in this extraordinarily polarized national debate. I think that some of the same things that are, I keep wanting to say that a lot of what's wrong with our journalism is also wrong with our society. And one of the things that's really destroyed our politics is that people don't really do local politics the same way anymore. Everybody is in this kind of this kind of polarized two-party national game where whether you're in some rural village in Texas or you're on the East Coast, if you're a Democrat, you're thinking about issues that don't even necessarily pertain to your community. And the same thing's happening on the right, and it's destroying us. And I think that that's really destroying, everybody has a very strong held belief that comes on a prefix menu that your side, one of two sides, hands out, and we get our cues from this, and we participate in the conversation on a macro level, when I think that a lot of insights and a lot of kind of nuance exists on the micro level. Absolutely.
We're probably over, but can I just say, having been a teacher for so long, and I just really always interested in young people, I would say I have something for the young people and the old people. For the young people, when you get that job, you gotta have a lot of respect for those senior people who are over you. You know, you're not special yet. You're special as a human being. You're special as hell as a human being. But those older people, the cranks, whatever, that need to help, how do I get on the internet? They know stuff. And they know more than you do in the beginning. So you should have respect for them as people who can teach you. I'm not saying a respect that, automatically you have respect for them as human beings, but don't come in thinking you know everything, because you're not, and don't come in thinking, I'll go to another place if I don't like it. They have that respect. And on the other side, I have to say the Times did a thing I thought was so outrageous to a young person. When the Tom Cotton editorial came out, the Times blamed the whole thing on a 25-year-old kid, Adam Rubenstein, who's a brilliant and lovely person. They wanted to stick it on something, and they found this kid at the very bottom of the goddamn system, and they put his name on it. And it was only when Bennett, in his last kind of moments, emailed AG and said, "You're defaming this kid," that the Times said, well, maybe there were other editors involved. And I thought that was, and this young man, a lovely young person, so I've seen some of the emails and texts he got from former friends, thinking that he was the person who had done this, and he was the person who's checking, and he doesn't have any power to put anybody in the Times. And I just thought, if we don't stand up, there's just this thing, you can, as a young person, you can be treated harshly by your boss, but if anybody comes out against you, you protect the young person at all costs. And you take the blame, and you don't say, as Bennett did, "Oh, I never read it." Of course he read it. Of course he read that piece. Of course, many senior editors at the Times read it. They all signed off on it. And they blame in print a 25-year-old? That, to me, those are norms that I think we gotta really be careful. Young people listen and learn, and all of us who are at the top, or the people who make these decisions, the young people are in an apprenticeship to a very noble profession. And you catch them every time they do something wrong, you pull them on the carpet for that, but you protect them 100% in moments like that. So I know it's a lot of Times bashing, and I love the Times and I'll always read it, but that really disgusted me.
But one thing that you're saying is that, I think that by and large, a lot of people don't know how to be, or don't want to be junior anymore. Yeah. People come in thinking that the people over them that have been doing the job for 30 years on a high level, are wrong about everything, are wrong about their worldview.
Right.
To arrive at work thinking that everybody above you is wrong in their worldview. It's an astonishing, I don't see how that holds.
When I found out that I would have qualified for food stamps for my first 2 years as a reporter, I was surprised. I did not know that because I was having such a good time writing 5 stories a day and just doing it. I thought that I had won the lottery, that I got to do this weird, crazy job where you get to ask powerful people difficult questions. You get to walk into the mayor's office and say, hey, what about that? And they've got to answer you. And you get to do all of this stuff. And beer was pretty cheap, so I didn't know. It felt pretty good to me, but I was very grateful to get to be doing what I was doing. We have some other lovely questions here, but mostly they reiterate things that were asked before. So I thank all of our online questioner, and I've just opened it up to you guys, starting with you, Michael. Any closing thoughts that you have or anything that we haven't explored before we say goodbye?
No, I think this has been a good, wide-ranging conversation, and I just, the pressures to conform to the silo are so great. And I just hope that people in, our profession resist that. It's just so much more interesting. Even if somebody's wrong, it's just so much more interesting engaging with, the diversity of thought out there. And, and it's no more, look, concentrate a little bit, I think, because of the nature of journalism on the left, but it certainly holds every bit as much for the right, and it's just a damn shame because there's so much kind of interesting contrarian thought out there, and I guess betraying my own bias, I think very often a little bit closer to that very elusive thing called truth. So anyway.
Thank you. Thomas?
Well, I just want to thank you for organizing this, and to be on a panel with Caitlin and Michael is awesome for me, and I wouldn't have missed it. And I just was happy to get in the conversation with 2 writers that inspire me. I think that people are pretty negative. The press gets, the media gets a really bad rap by people who don't work in it, but there are so many professionals, and at all of these institutions that get knocked, there are people that that are not public facing, that are extraordinary professionals: editors, fact checkers, writers, people working on the business side. And most people are really out there trying their best, and a lot of what's going on now, I think, is just is a part of a larger problem that's going on in the culture. But I think that having discussions like this, I think they're really important. And I think that it's really important to talk to readers, people who are not just trying to be writers, but people who are trying to understand why it's so frustrating to read certain publications. Because I think that there are frustrations, but I think that people are really trying to make the media ecosystem work.
Caitlin, I knew that you would cuss the most.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry.
No.
Okay.
I think this is halfway.
This is why I can't be a conservative. Like I just got cussing on the AEI podcast.
I halfway did this just to meet you because I'm such a great admirer of your work and the wonderful dash of salt that you put into this. So profane or not, any closing thoughts for the folks?
Well, it's just a confession that I don't have the courage I wish I had. There are topics I think I could add a lot to the conversation about. And the only reason I don't is because I don't have the courage. I don't have the courage to face the mob. It's just, I don't have it. And I'm not proud of that. But there are many topics that people write to me over and over again. Would you ever write about this? I'd like to know what you think about it. And I have to say, I don't have the courage. So that's a confession. And I guess to young people, if you're courageous, this is the job for you. And the rest of us who are in it, we just, when Thomas wrote that letter or spearheaded that letter, it was tremendous act of courage, and it came at a tremendous cost because of the way people, and then one woman unsigned it the next day, which was like, wow, that's a real act of courage.
And then say that she didn't actually know what she was signing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, but the more people that can be courageous, that's what we need. And being courageous against this leftist, the right, forget them, the lunatics with their Confederate flags. I'm not worried about them. But this left, the more we can be courageous and take the hits that come with it, that's a way out of this mess.
So be as brave as you can be. Well, we are really grateful to you guys for being here. I feel like I'm a lot smarter, and oddly, for all of the charred remains of an industry that we just talked about, more optimistic after having talked to you guys. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And for all of you folks who joined us, thank you for being here, and we will talk to you next time.